ogni fortistiere marcia verso l'avvenire.
Benito Mussolini considered himself heir to the great Caesars of the past and was determined to create a great new Roman Empire. To prove his success to his own people and the world, he would acquire a new colony for Italy in Africa. In 1930, in the East African nation of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor, King of Kings, the Lion of Judah. According to legend, this proud emperor was a direct descendant of Solomon and Sheba. Educated in Europe, he was determined to bring his 3,000-year-old primitive kingdom into the 20th century. This is a story of brutal conquest and blithe ignorance. Ethiopia, a primitive African kingdom, would soon be overrun by Benito Mussolini's mechanized fascist army. The tactics used by the Italian forces would outrage Americans. As we launched protest after protest to no avail, we would fail to recognize that what had occurred was the final chapter of a century of European imperial conquest and the first hint of the manner in which World War II would be fought. By 1934, Mussolini had forged one of the most powerful armies in Europe. He proclaimed that it was Italy's duty and right to colonize and civilize Ethiopia. In her first attempt, Italy had been defeated in 1896. Vengeance for that humiliation would be a test of the modern Italian spirit. Haile Selassie was enough of a realist to take Mussolini seriously, but he placed his faith in the League of Nations to stop Italian aggression, and the rest of the world shared his hopes. Ethiopia was not representative of Africa. As one of two independent nations on that continent in 1935, we tended to view Haile Selassie's kingdom as a totally isolated entity. As for the rest of Africa, few native emissaries ever visited the formal reception rooms of the State Department. Africa was simply considered a European colony. Black Americans who might have raised their voices in protest were themselves not fully franchised as American citizens. In the 1930s, they were a silent minority. So the problems of Africa in general and Ethiopia in particular were largely beyond the concern of most Americans, an opaqueness we would all pay for. Italy's Ethiopian venture was the outgrowth of the political turmoil that followed the First World War. By 1922, a restless journalist named Benito Mussolini and his ruthless fascist party emerged from the pack. Mussolini promised law and order and a war on communism. Mussolini sprang to power with his flamboyant march on Rome and aligned his fascisti with the church, the monarchy, and the middle class. He became prime minister under King Victor Emmanuel. His strong will and charisma instilled a new pride in Italians. During his bombastic reign, the strutting Il Duce would spread fear throughout Europe as he announced plans to rearm Italy. Mussolini was impulsive, ambitious, unpredictable. He was also a tyrant and a militarist who once said, "War is to man as maternity is to woman." Mussolini would wage war with a modern mechanized army and a powerful air force. The dictator admired American General Billy Mitchell and was impressed by his demonstrations of air power. Because Il Duce's militancy and saber rattling alarmed many Americans, in 1931 he broadcast a message of peace to the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very glad to take this opportunity. Italy will never take the initiative in promoting war.
By 1934, the world depression slowed down his domestic program. Mussolini decided that his people needed a national challenge to boost their spirits. They would acquire a new colony next to Italian Somaliland in Ethiopia. His target was Walwal, a desert watering hole. On December 5th, 1934, under the leadership of Marshal de Bono, an incompetent World War I general, Italian troops provoked a skirmish over the water rights at Walwal. The Ethiopians were easily routed in this test encounter. In Addis Ababa, an enraged Haile Selassie demanded that the League of Nations punish Italy. He had every reason to believe that the League would stop Mussolini. Mussolini claimed that he was provoked and that the League should instead censure Ethiopia. The League discussed the Walwal incident reluctantly, afraid to offend Mussolini, who was considered a buffer to Nazi Germany. Hitler's appearance in Venice underscored the terrifying possibility that the two fascist dictators might join forces. The Venice meeting was a disaster. From the beginning, the imperious Il Duce in complete dress regalia snubbed Hitler, who arrived in a blue serge suit. Mussolini was cool and condescending. The differences between Hitler and Mussolini were best characterized by their acceptance in the Western world, especially America. In 1928, his autobiography was serialized in the conservative Saturday Evening Post. The House of Morgan in 1926 loaned Mussolini $100 million. In a gesture of friendship, President Hoover gave fascism a boost by graciously receiving Mussolini's foreign minister at the White House. Such international figures as Winston Churchill found his policies commendable, and Will Rogers, after a personal interview, called Benito Mussolini a regular guy. Cole Porter's hit song began, "You're the tops, you're Mussolini." Even FDR had an affinity for Mussolini, who he referred to in a letter as that admirable Italian gentleman. Prior to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, no authentic public opinion surveys were taken in the United States during Mussolini's regime, but it would be safe to say that the majority of Americans approved of Mussolini. Many actually admired him as a romantic, if somewhat clownish figure who, as the saying went, made the trains run on time. This attitude was fostered by a number of sympathetic authors and journalists. Anne O'Hare McCormick, writing for the New York Times, found Mussolini an incarnation of the ancient splendor of Rome, a revered statesman not intoxicated but mellowed by power. Lincoln Steffens, a widely syndicated journalist, waxed poetic that, I quote, God had formed Mussolini out of a rib of Italy. As early as 1923, however, Ernest Hemingway wrote that Il Duce was the biggest bluff in Europe.
There was a comical image to Mussolini which served to soften the more aggressive, belligerent aspects. But if there was a parallel, that it was usually drawn between Theodore Roosevelt, a man on the horseback type of figure, who sort of took history, seized history by his own hands and bent it to his will, and reassured Americans that human intelligence and will was still in control of events.
From San Francisco to New York, Italian Americans lionized Il Duce. He gave them a new sense of identity.
Mussolini was symbolic to American Italians, not because Italian Americans were fascist, not even because Mussolini was fascist, but because Mussolini was an Italian. And the Italian American population in the United States, being near the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, felt that Mussolini was doing something. He was getting headlines for Italy. They were proud of the fact that Italy now seemed to be one of the great powers, and this rubbed off upon them as one of the lower levels of the American immigrant group.
For the blacks in America, it took a flamboyant figure, Marcus Garvey, to remind them of their African heritage. In the 1920s, his Back to Africa national movement influenced many blacks. A colorful adventurer and aviator, Colonel Hubert Julian, known as the Black Eagle of Harlem, urged his people to join their brothers in Ethiopia. Blacks were developing a political consciousness. Novelist Richard Wright described their bitter legacy. Our outward guise, he said, still carries the old familiar aspect which 300 years of oppression in America have given us, but beneath the garb of the black laborer, the black cook, the black elevator operator, lies an uneasily tied knot of pain and hope. In the summer of '35, many American blacks signed up to go to Ethiopia. There's no record of how many, if any, actually did go. Nevertheless, the hostility between blacks and Italian Americans became intense.
There are a number of them. Riots in Harlem and in Little Italy, Mulberry Street in New York City, and there were clashes reported in Chicago and San Francisco between blacks and Italian Americans. But the most dramatic episode occurred during the heavyweight prize fight between Joe Louis and the Italian contender Primo Carnera. There were riots afterwards outside the stadium and knifings, and some pistol shots were fired. The New York riot squad had a busy evening that time.
At the same time, most American blacks were far more concerned with surviving in what they considered to be a racist America. And we must remember also that these were Depression years, and that Depression years were even harder on blacks than they were on other people. So that the energies of American blacks were spent primarily on eking out a living, finding a job in Depression America.
As for the national policy, it had not changed in the 30s. America was still an isolationist country, remembering too vividly the First World War.
Despite what happens in continents overseas, the United States of America shall and must remain as long ago the father of our country prayed that it might remain, unentangled and free.
Italian troops training at the leash were set off to invade Abyssinia. Duce was encouraged in his African venture. The League of Nations had taken no action in the Wall controversy, and Mussolini was aware of a secret agreement between France and Britain not to interfere with his plans. On October 3rd, 1935, more than 250,000 Italian troops, complemented by thousands of well-trained Somali natives, crossed the northern and southern borders of Ethiopia. They advanced unchallenged for 2 days. From Addis Ababa, Selassie announced to the world that Italy was the aggressor. He fervently hoped that his barefoot soldiers with World War I weapons would be rescued from massacre by the League of Nations. His strategy was to send small units to the front at first and let the desolate mountain and desert terrain hold back the invaders. The first major confrontation was at Adawa, the site of the Italian defeat in 1896. Perhaps not since the invention of gunpowder had one army enjoyed such military supremacy. It took only 4 days for the fascist army to achieve victory and avenge their earlier humiliation. The war was marked by much pure savagery. Mussolini's mechanized army decimated Selassie's primitive tribesmen. Francis Pierre Laval, whose secret agreement paved the way for Mussolini's conquest, guided the League of Nations toward the imposition of only mild sanctions against Italy. The League censured Italy as the aggressor and suspended all economic relations with her, but voted against sending arms or troops to Selassie. The vote satisfied the conscience of most European leaders who refused to see beyond the hypocrisy of their actions For all intents and purposes, Ethiopia had been sacrificed. The fear of a potential alliance between Italy and Germany had paralyzed European statesmen.
In un tempo in cui Roma aveva Cesare, Virgilio ed Augusto.
Mussolini protested that his cause was just and resigned Italy from the League of Nations. World opinion turned against Italy. In England, where the public was revolted by Mussolini's bullyism and disgusted by the League's impotence, Italian-owned stores became targets for frustration and anger. Throughout American urban ghettos like New York's Harlem, angry blacks protested and smashed the windows of Italian shopkeepers. Nevertheless, government policy remained neutral.
The United States is following a twofold neutrality towards any and all nations which engage in wars that are not of immediate concern to the Americas. First, we decline to encourage the prosecution of war by permitting belligerents to obtain arms, ammunition, or implements of war from the United States. Nations seeking expansion.
FDR did manage to get Congress approval of a moral embargo on trade with Italy of all raw materials except oil.
I think it would be quite fair to say, with hindsight, certainly, that the United States did very little to enforce any moral embargo other than making protestations and declarations. I think it's quite clear that had there been an effective embargo against oil for the Italian war machine, that the Italian invasion would have had to come to a halt.
Mussolini, with a free hand to pursue the war, ordered his army to conquer Ethiopia as quickly as possible. Marshal Badoglio was put in charge and authorized to use any weapons or tactics necessary to win the war. This included mustard gas, though outlawed by the Geneva Convention. Badoglio, a witness to Billy Mitchell's demonstration of air power, now put the lesson to appalling use. Mussolini's brother Vittorio, a pilot, enjoyed killing from the air. These were his words. As the bomb fell in their midst and blew them up, one group of horsemen gave me the impression of a budding rose unfolding. Reports of poison gas, indiscriminate bombings, and other atrocities stunned the Western world. Mussolini's heroic image was tarnished by adverse, if not always accurate, press reports.
There was a good deal of confusion in reporting the war because it was difficult to get to the site of the battles. Many of the reporters rushed over there with an adventurous sense of a romantic type of desert warfare, as though it would be a chapter out of T.E. Lawrence. They found out it was anything but that, and it was rather a dull and dragged out, essentially undramatic war. And as a result, a number of journalists began to fabricate stories. One consequence of that is they wrote news accounts which were definitely sympathetic to the Ethiopians and misled the public into believing that the Ethiopians were doing better than they actually were doing. So no one was prepared with the collapse of the Haile Selassie's forces.
Mussolini was surprised by the speedy Italian success. Prepared for a 6-year war, it ended in 6 months. The efficient Italian war machine devastated both Selassie's primitive army and his primitive country. A gentle monarch was driven out of a land which, in the words of Winston Churchill, no conqueror in 4,000 years ever thought worthwhile to subdue. Emperor Selassie and his 2 sons were forced to flee before the Italians marched on his capital, Addis Ababa. About 700,000 Ethiopians were killed. About 2,000 Italians died. On May 9, 1936, Mussolini declared in Rome that Ethiopia now belonged to Italy. It was Mussolini's first conquest. It was also an early warning of fascist intentions, and America ignored the cry.
It was held by Franklin Roosevelt that eventually Il Duce would restore democratic processes and parliamentary forms of government, so that our support for fascism was based on, I think, two fallacies. One was that fascism is the answer to communism, and secondly, fascism is a transitory episode that will eventually result in the restoration of democratic forms of government. Now, neither of these two assumptions proved to be the case.
Selassie was granted exile in the guilt-ridden but generous England. However, he demanded the opportunity to address the League of Nations as soon as possible, hoping to salvage at least his self-respect. The embarrassed League had no choice but to give him the podium. Italian journalists heaped upon him the final and most humiliating indignity.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le...
After the Italian journalist hecklers were ejected from the hall, Haile Selassie continued, and he said this: "It is international morality that is at stake. Apart from the kingdom of the Lord, there is not on this earth any nation which is superior to any other. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." The wisdom and prophetic nature of Haile Selassie's speech at the League of Nations went unheeded. The world listened but did nothing, paralyzed by insecurity and fear of fascist military strength. By turning our backs on the Abyssinian War, the United States refused to face the fact that Mussolini's takeover of the primitive African nation was no different from traditional European colonization. Our reluctance to strongly oppose outright aggression in 1935, simply because an ocean separated us, was a policy that gratified both Hitler and Mussolini, as well as American pacifists and isolationists. The Neutrality Act of 1935, which prohibited the shipment of arms to belligerents, helped assure the victory of Italy's well-equipped modern army. The ease with which Italy overpowered Ethiopia was a signal to fascist dictators that democratic nations would not resist their urge for conquest with anything but words. Ethiopia set the stage for European conquest.